was the kind of night that swallowed sound. The wind howled in sharp gusts outside my small house at the edge of town, rattling the old window panes. Rain fell in sheets, drumming relentlessly against the roof. I had always loved storms. There was something cleansing about them. But tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier, weighted with an anticipation I couldn't name. I was nursing a cup of tea in the dim light of my living room when it happened. 3 sharp knocks at the door. I froze. The clock above the mantel chimed softly, signaling the stroke of midnight. No one came to visit me, especially not at this hour. My heart began to thud heavily in my chest, the sound almost drowning out the persistent tapping of rain. For a moment, I debated ignoring it. But the knocking came again, harder this time, more insistent. Rising slowly, I crossed the room, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. I hesitated as I reached the door, my hand hovering over the latch. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice unsteady. The reply came, low and familiar. "It's me, Archer." The words were simple, but they hit me like a punch to the chest. Mr. Archer had been my neighbor decades ago, when I was just a child. I hadn't thought about him in years, not since the night he vanished without a trace. He'd been the kind of man people whispered about, reclusive, peculiar, always tinkering with strange devices in his garage. I pulled the door open, the cool night air rushing in. There he stood, illuminated by the weak glow of my porch light. His face was unchanged, sharp features, piercing gray eyes, and the same herringbone coat I remembered from years ago. The rain didn't seem to touch him. His clothes were perfectly dry. "You're alive." The words tumbled out of my mouth before I could stop them. His expression didn't shift, but his voice carried a strange urgency. "I need your help. There isn't much time." "Time for what?" I asked, my fingers tightening on the edge of the door. His eyes flickered, as though he was looking past me, into the house. "It's hard to explain, but if you don't come now, we'll both lose everything." I followed him without thinking. The rain lashed at my face as I trailed Mr. Archer across the narrow street to his house. It looked exactly as I remembered, a squat, unassuming structure with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The yard was overgrown, the once trim hedges wild and clawing at the windows like desperate fingers. He opened the door without a key, and the warm, musty scent of old wood and dust washed over me. The house was dimly lit, its interior frozen in time. Faded floral wallpaper curled at the edges, and ancient furniture stood as it had decades ago. It was like stepping into a memory. "Why are you still here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Archer didn't answer immediately. He led me down the narrow hallway to a door I didn't remember, one that seemed out of place. Its dark wood was pristine, polished to a mirror-like sheen. "Through here," he said, his hand resting on the brass knob. "What's in there?" I asked, my stomach knotting. "Proof," he said simply. The door creaked open, revealing a room I couldn't reconcile with the modest house I thought I knew. It was cavernous, its high ceiling disappearing into shadows. The walls were lined with clocks, hundreds of them, all shapes and sizes. Their ticking filled the air, a rhythmic cacophony that made my skin crawl. But the strangest part was the photograph. It hung on the far wall, framed in tarnished gold, larger than life. It depicted Archer and me. I stepped closer, my heart hammering. The photo was impossibly old, its sepia tones giving it an air of antiquity. I was younger in the image, barely more than a teenager. My arm was draped casually around Archer's shoulders, and we were both smiling at the camera. The caption below chilled me to the core. "Archer, and my name, 1974. "That's impossible," I whispered. "I wasn't even born then." Archer stood beside me, his gaze fixed on the photograph. Time doesn't move in a straight line here. It folds, tangles, loops back on itself. This room is the anchor. Anchor for what? For everything, he said. His voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that made my chest tighten. I made a mistake years ago. I thought I could control it. But the loops have started to unravel, and if we don't fix them... He trailed off, his expression grim. What happens if we don't? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. His eyes met mine, their intensity piercing. Then neither of us will exist anymore, and neither will the world as you know it. Before I could respond, one of the clocks let out a sharp, discordant chime. Then another and another, until the sound was deafening. Archer grabbed my arm, his grip firm. "It's starting," he said. "We need to move." The room seemed to shift around us, the walls rippling as though they were made of liquid. I stumbled, the photograph blurring before my eyes. When I looked again, I saw my own reflection staring back at me, older, gaunt, and frightened. "Archer," I gasped, my voice trembling. "What's happening?" But he didn't answer. His focus was on the shifting walls, his face set in grim determination. "Trust me," he said, pulling me toward the door. I wasn't sure I did, but as the air grew heavier and the room began to fade, I knew I didn't have a choice. The sensation of stepping through the door was indescribable. It wasn't like walking into another room. It was like being pulled apart and stitched back together. My consciousness stretched thin and taut over an eternity. When my feet touched solid ground again, I was standing in my own childhood home. But something was wrong. The living room was achingly familiar. The faded yellow wallpaper, the scuffed hardwood floor, the patched-up armchair where my father used to sit. Yet the light filtering through the curtains was wrong, dim and sepia-toned, as if the entire scene were an old photograph. The air carried a strange metallic tang that made my stomach churn. "Archer," I called out, but my voice was muffled, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. The house felt deserted, yet not empty. The shadows along the edges of the room seemed thicker, darker, as though they were alive and watching. Then I heard it, a faint echo of laughter coming from upstairs. I froze. It was my laugh, but younger, lighter. The sound stirred an ache of nostalgia laced with dread. Against my better judgment, I moved toward the stairs, my legs heavy as though wading through molasses. As I climbed, the air grew colder, each step creaking loudly beneath my weight. The laughter faded, replaced by a series of whispers, disjointed, overlapping, impossible to understand. My name was among them, spoken in a tone that felt both familiar and alien. At the top of the stairs, I saw myself. A child version of me, no older than 8, sat cross-legged on the floor, a toy train clutched in one hand. He, or I, was staring out the window, humming a tune I didn't remember. My heart thundered in my chest as I took a step closer. "Hello?" I whispered. The child didn't respond. He simply turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his profile. My blood ran cold. His eyes were completely black, as if the shadows from the living room had seeped into him. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The child tilted his head, a slow, unnatural motion, and smiled. A too wide, too perfect smile that made my skin crawl. "You don't remember," he said, his voice overlapping with mine and something far older. "You left me here." I stumbled back, my pulse racing. "Left you? I don't understand." The whispers grew louder, pressing against my ears like a rising tide. The shadows in the hallway seemed to inch closer, swallowing the edges of the walls. Before I could say another word, the child dissolved into smoke, his form unraveling into the air. I reached out instinctively, but my hand passed through empty space. The house began to warp, the walls bending inward as though the entire structure was collapsing. Then I heard Archer's voice. "It's a loop," he shouted, though I couldn't see him. "Don't trust the echoes. They're fragments, pieces of what's been lost." The floor shifted beneath me, and I fell through. I landed with a jolt in total darkness. The air was still and suffocating, heavy with the scent of damp earth. I fumbled forward, my hands searching for anything solid. My fingertips grazed cold metal, railings. It was a staircase, winding downward into the unknown. "Archer," I called, but my voice was swallowed by the void. A faint light appeared far below, flickering like a dying candle. With no other choice, I began my descent, each step groaning beneath my weight. The whispers returned, faint but persistent, threading themselves through the silence. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was different this time, calm, deliberate, and far too close. I whipped around, but there was nothing behind me. The light below grew brighter, and I hurried my pace, eager to escape the suffocating darkness. At the bottom of the staircase, I found myself in a circular chamber lined with mirrors. They stretched from floor to ceiling, their surfaces tarnished and cracked. The light came from a single bulb hanging from a wire, its dim glow casting eerie reflections that multiplied endlessly in the mirrored walls. In the center of the room was a desk, and on it lay a journal bound in cracked leather. I approached cautiously, the reflections shifting with each step. The journal seemed out of place, too new, too clean compared to the room's decay. I opened it, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with frantic, looping script. "Anchor the timeline. Choose the path. Beware the reflection." Over and over, the same phrases repeated, growing messier, more chaotic. My breath caught as I reached the final entry. "You must choose. Only one reality survives." A chill ran down my spine as I looked up. In the mirrors, my reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't moving. It stood perfectly still, watching, its face twisted into an expression of mockery. I backed away, but the reflection stepped forward, breaking the pattern of the other mirrors. Its lips moved, though no sound escaped. Then slowly it raised a hand and pointed to the desk. On the surface lay 2 keys, one gold, one silver. I picked them up, their weight surprising me. The gold key felt warm, pulsing faintly against my palm, while the silver was icy cold, its surface smooth as glass. The whispers surged louder, their tone urgent. "Choose wisely. Not all paths lead back." "What happens if I choose wrong?" I whispered aloud. The reflection smiled, its mouth forming words I couldn't hear. Its eyes glowed faintly, mirroring the light from the bulb above. A door appeared behind me, its frame carved with the same looping runes I had seen in Archer's house. The air hummed with tension, and the keys in my hand seemed to vibrate in response. With a deep breath, I stepped toward the door, unsure whether I was sealing my fate or saving it. The door loomed before me, carved with twisting runes that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The keys in my hand grew heavier with each passing second, their opposing warmth and chill seeping into my skin. The whispers around me had become a low chant, a rhythmic pulse that synchronized with my racing heart. Choose wisely. Not all paths lead back. The golden key shimmered, its warmth spreading through my palm like the first rays of dawn. It felt comforting, familiar, almost safe. The silver key, in stark contrast, exuded an icy stillness, a quiet that was deeply unsettling. Holding them both was like standing at the edge of 2 worlds, each pulling me in opposite directions. I glanced back at the mirrors, hoping for guidance, but my reflection offered none. It stood still, silent, its expression unreadable. Yet its eyes seemed to pierce through me, carrying an unspoken urgency. I turned back to the door and inserted the gold key into the lock. The runes on the frame flared brightly, casting shifting shadows across the room. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, resonant ticking that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I hesitated, the weight of the silver key pressing against my other palm. The whispers had warned, not all paths lead back. What if this was the wrong choice? Before I could second-guess myself, the door swung open with a groan that echoed through the chamber. A golden light spilled out, warm and inviting, pulling me forward. I stepped through, clutching the silver key tightly in my other hand. The air on the other side was still, heavy with an unnatural silence. I stood in a vast, golden expanse, a strange liminal space where the horizon blurred into an indistinct haze. Ahead of me was a massive clock, its face suspended in midair, its hands unmoving. Its design was intricate, its brass surface adorned with the same runes that had marked the door. As I approached, the golden light dimmed, and the air grew colder. The clock's hands began to twitch, their movements erratic, as though struggling to synchronize. "It's broken," a voice said behind me. I turned sharply to see Archer standing a few feet away, his face etched with a weariness that hadn't been there before. He looked older now, his once sharp features softened by time. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice trembling. He gestured toward the clock. "This is the anchor point, the source of the loops. Every choice, every path begins and ends here." The clock shuddered, its hands spinning wildly before stopping at midnight. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through my bones. Archer's expression darkened. "It's unraveling," he said, his voice barely audible. "You have to stabilize it or everything, your reality, mine, all of it, will collapse." I stepped closer to the clock, the silver key growing colder in my hand. "How?" Archer nodded toward the key. "Insert it into the heart of the mechanism. But understand this, stabilizing the clock means making a choice. You won't be able to undo it." I stared at the clock, its immense face reflecting fractured versions of myself. Younger, older, distorted. Each reflection seemed to move independently, their movements out of sync with mine. The silver key pulsed in my hand, its chill biting into my skin. "What happens if I choose wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Archer's gaze was steady, but his silence was answer enough. Taking a deep breath, I approached the base of the clock. A small circular indentation lay at its center, perfectly shaped for the key. My hand trembled as I pressed the silver key into place. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deafening clang, the clock roared to life. Its hands spun rapidly, the ticking growing louder and louder until it filled the entire space. The golden light around me flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. The reflections on the clock's face stilled, their movements aligning with mine. The ticking slowed, becoming steady and rhythmic, a sound both comforting and ominous. Archer let out a long breath. "It's done." I turned to him, but his form was already fading, dissolving into the golden light. "Wait," I called out, but he shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Your path is set now," he said, his voice distant. "Make it count." The light dimmed further, and I found myself standing in my living room. The storm outside had passed, and the house was quiet, untouched by the chaos I had just escaped. The clock above the mantel ticked softly, its sound steady and unremarkable. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to believe it was over. But then I noticed something strange, a faint, silvery glint on the edge of my reflection in the window. It was my face, but not my eyes. They were watching, unblinking, from somewhere just beyond the glass. And deep in the house, barely audible, I heard it. The echo of another clock, ticking out of sync,